Hi, welcome to Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. This is a show all about farmers markets. Whether you're a farmers market manager, a farmer, or a food producer selling at farmers markets, or just a curious farmers market shopper, this is the podcast for you. This week on Tent Talk, we had the chance to speak with Ben Feldman, the policy director for the National Farmers Market Coalition, which is a nonprofit dedicated to strengthening farmers markets across the United States. On today's episode, we get a little nerdy and dive deep into some food policy. In our conversation, Ben tells us about his passion for farmers markets, gives us an update on current Farmers Market Coalition projects, and clues us in on important food system issues. Hi, I'm one of your hosts, Bridget Myers. I've spent years as an on-site farmers market manager, and I've done it all from tasting new vendor samples to dealing with portable toilet placement issues.
And I'm Justine Marzoni-Mead, hot sauce maker, farmers market vendor, and event facilitator for the Intense Conference.
And I'm Kat Fields-White, director of San Diego Markets, still an active farmers market manager and advocate, and founder of Intense Business.
Welcome back to Tent Talk. This week, our guest is Ben Feldman, who currently serves as the policy director for the National Farmers Market Coalition. He helped found the California Alliance of Farmers Markets, served as a vice chair of the CDFA Farmers Market Advisory Committee, administered the California Market Match Program, and championed policy to improve access for low-income shoppers to shop at farmers markets. And he put in his time at the other side of the table, having sold produce and baked goods at farm stands and farmers markets. All right.
Hello.
How are you, Ben?
Good. How are you all?
Good.
Good. Sorry for the complication.
No problem. It shocked us into here. We're ready now.
In podcast mode now. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us and speaking with us today. I think we're kind of lucky to talk to you because I think a lot of our listeners will be interested in what you have to say. But if you can just give us a little background, you've had a long history with farmers markets. Did you come from a farming or food service background, or where did you kind of start out?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's always nice to talk about farmers markets. I spend a lot of time thinking about them, so always happy to talk about them.
Yeah.
I started selling at farmers markets when I was in college, but when I grew up in a rural community and spent a lot of time out in open spaces and farms out in Winters, California. And so I spent a lot of time around agriculture when I was a kid. Family didn't farm in any way in which it was our profession, but it was definitely something we did for our own food. I started in farmers markets selling bread, and then also selling for a farm at a produce stand, and then spent time working through farmers markets in various capacities, selling at them, managing them, working with groups of them, in the case of the California Alliance of Farmers Markets, and then now I work for the Farmers Market Coalition on federal policy advocacy with farmers markets. So I'm really lucky that I've been able to spend a career in farmers markets. I certainly didn't know that was a career path that was available to me when I was a kid, but I'm really fortunate to have been able to make a career out of it with so many wonderful people in this work.
Yeah, absolutely. We all love that too. I think we kind of have that shared love of it and not really realizing this could be a real job. Yeah. But here we are. Here we are. So you helped found the California Alliance of Farmers Markets while you're at the Ecology Center. And was that the first organization to represent all the farmers markets in California?
So prior to the formation of the California Alliance of Farmers Markets, there had been, as I understand it, a couple efforts to organize farmers markets. There was the California Federation of Certified Farmers Markets for a period of time. I think as you all know, farmers markets in California in their sort of current capacity go back to the late 70s, and the Federation has a long history among some of the very early pioneers of farmers markets in sort of their current form in California. But then I think in the way that organizations sometimes do, there's just sometimes it's hard to maintain momentum, and so there was a gap. There was a gap period where there wasn't a entity that was working with farmers markets to represent sort of their interests in the needs that they have, both on the policy front and just sort of a professional development and all the important services that many industry or professional associations provide.
Oh, okay.
And it's been pretty successful at that, I think, just in pulling people together and being able to have a voice in the legislature and kind of responding to policy issues. So that's been cool. But you were really active there, and then you moved on to the Farmers Market Coalition. Did you go into FMC as a policy advisor or a different role?
So I served on the board of the Farmers Market Coalition for a number of years, and then stepped down from the board at a time when FMC was making a decision to move more intentionally into a greater policy capacity, because I felt like I might be interested in that position. So yes, I was then hired on, and I now serve as the policy director for the Farmers Market Coalition. So my first, so I worked for about a year and a half now with the Farmers Market Coalition. The focus of my work here at the Farmers Market Coalition is making sure that farmers markets and the farmers who sell at them, I should say, as well as the customers who shop at them, understand the way in which federal policy influences farmers markets and their opportunities to engage in that process. So, a lot of my day-to-day work is sharing information about the status of lately it's been the Farm Bill, and then helping markets connect with their federal legislators around the policies and trying to help legislators understand the impacts of their decisions on markets.
So you spend a lot of time as Mr. Feldman goes to Washington. Do you spend a lot of time in chambers and lobbies and talking to those folks?
So I do still live in California because most of the work is, again, communications and grassroots engagement with our members and our state and network leaders in order to help make sure that they are in touch with their legislators. I do spend a lot more time in DC than I used to. I've come to really like DC as a city, so it's fun.
Yeah, that is fun. And it's so different than California. It's a nice bounce back and forth. You mentioned farmers and the shoppers. Does FMC see itself as representing just the farm side of markets, or as an organization, do you also think you represent the bakers and the hot sauce makers and the coffee roasters that tend to be found in modern day farmers markets? It's not just the farmers. Do you see that as one constituency, or do you see yourself representing more just the certified farmers market section?
That's a great question, Kat. And I would say nationally, California has a certified farmers market section, right? That is the farmers. Nationwide, there's, there isn't that distinction. And so I think, sometimes there's actually even more gradations between those things. So what I'm leading at is, yes, I think absolutely FMC's mission is to support or to strengthen farmers markets for the benefit of farmers, shoppers, and communities. And I think our membership is primarily farmers market operators, right? We have nearly 5,000 of the nation's farmers markets represent as part of our membership. But the importance, the reason we want strong farmers markets and the reason we care about farmers markets is because of what they do for farmers, for shoppers, and for communities, right? So we see our role as working for all of those end constituents, and we certainly include vendors in that.
So in terms of your membership, are you looking mostly at market managers and organizations that sponsor markets, or do you promote membership to individual farmers and vendors and market supporters like shoppers?
Yeah, our membership is really open to all of those groups, but I think what has the reason our membership is the way it is, I think, is because there are many organizations for both consumers and farmers who care about food, right? There are groups that represent farmers. There are groups that represent consumers. What there are not as many of is groups that represent folks who do run the markets. And so that's a role that, is important for us to play and important as this industry grows. you all know the tremendous work that farmers market managers do.
Yes, we do.
Right? I mean, you've lived it.
We sure do. We're still living it. Yeah, there's not a lot of support for the people that are kind of out in the trenches or out in the streets and moving the barricades. And
yeah, and it's, it's under the radar, behind the scenes, unsung work. People don't often, I have conversations with folks about, what it takes to run markets. And I think people miss the important role that farmers market operators play, the great deal of coordinating that they do, the conflict resolution that they do, not to mention the specific services that many organizations that operate markets do in terms of SNAP and WIC and incentives and promotion and, all that stuff.
The logistical stuff, I think people just don't seem aware of it. We talk to so many people that are actually pretty aware consumers and shoppers that'll come out and say, so why would you have staff? They just come out and set up tents, right? No, not exactly.
Yeah. They say, what do you do the other days of the week? It's not market day. Like, this is your part-time job. It's like, no.
Yeah. It just goes to show, like, you don't know what you don't know. And I think it's really easy to assume that what other people do is really easy, right?
Yeah.
Like,
that's amazing. All the jobs in the world.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about some current projects that Farmers Market Coalition is working on? Kind of what's on your front burner right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, policy advocacy is important. We did also just have, I'm just going to mention something. We just wrapped up two things, actually. One is the first ever direct marketing agricultural summit just happened in DC.
Oh, yeah.
It was last week. And there were between 350 and 400 people who work in farmers market. Many of them were coming from a research perspective, and then a large contingent of farmers market managers and a fair bit of government folks as well. And it was a very eye-opening and exciting summit. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm around it, and it seems like there's a momentum to have another one. So that's very exciting. And I think there's, this is the kind of thing that we've, as we were just talking about, more resources to support the type of work and show the impact of markets is really important. And so that was exciting to see sort of the cross connection between the research side of this work, which I think is historically been under represented in research literature. So, that's nice. And then also, of course, market managers are very practical on the ground people. So having them provided a real reality check in terms of how to do research. And then there was also just starting to be some more of the farmers market type stuff. So that was pretty exciting. And then, of course, again, National Farmers Market Week, that was now a few weeks ago, but this was definitely for Farmers Market Coalition in terms of the amount of social media activity, the number of events, the number of states and municipalities recognizing their own state or local Farmers Market Week. This was by far the biggest one that we've had. Okay. So that's some really great attention to farmers markets. And then, actually, I said I was going to mention two things, and I lied. I'm going to mention three. Did you hear Willie Nelson's comments about farmers markets at Farm Aid?
No.
Oh, you should go check those out. He was talking about the importance of farmers markets in supporting farmers, and one of our staff who was there said that between his songs, he actually stopped and was engaging with the audience, saying, "So what are you going to do when you see a farmer's market?" And they would all yell, "Stop!"
Wow!
Bye.
Let's get Willie Nelson on our podcast.
Yeah.
Calling him next. Forrest Pritchard, who spoke at our Intense conference last year and who wrote Gaining Ground on how farmers markets essentially saved his multi-generational family farm from ruin. Apparently they were throwing photos of him up on the screen behind John Mellencamp and things at Farm Aid, and he was really excited. He's been posting them and said he wasn't there. They said, "Oh, were you there? Was it so exciting?" He said, "No, I was working the farmers market, but people sent me pictures."
That's so great.
So, Ben, so you've obviously been involved in farmers markets for a quite a long time now, both from, both on either sides of the booth, so to speak. But how have you seen farmers market change and evolve over the years that you've been involved in them?
That's a great question. I think one thing that I think there have been a number of changes. I think we have, as we touched on a little bit in this conversation, there's been a rise in the professional organizations, the market operators that have now been doing this for decades. So there's a level of experience and knowledge base that certainly didn't exist when I started. Even when I first started hiring market managers, it was unusual for me to be able to find someone who had experience running farmers markets. And now, over the last few years, when I've been looking for candidates in pretty much any of this work, it feels like the majority of candidates actually have had some experience, either at least selling at farmers markets, and in many cases helping to run markets.
So it's really become a profession.
But yeah, that's certainly something that I've seen. And obviously we still have many, many farmers markets that are run by, entirely by volunteers, and definitely are very minimally resourced organizations, and are doing it because they're excited about, what a farmers market can bring to their community. And, but that is something that I don't remember really feeling like existed when I started. I think the spread, I think the sheer number of farmers markets is a little mind-boggling. And then I think, the farmers market industry, I think has really influenced I'll go ahead and say it, I think they've changed the way Americans eat. And I think that influence has been felt in restaurants and grocery stores and produce box delivery programs, and that people eat kale, right?
Just to make it real simple. Yeah. People eating kale.
It's no longer just the stuff that they put at Pizza Hut, in the, how back in the day, kale just used to, used to be the buffet decoration.
I think in 2012 more, I think you're absolutely right. I think I remember looking that up. I think there's statistics that in 2012 more kale was eaten or was used as salad bar garnishes than
that was eaten. Yeah. And we flipped it. We flipped that
entirely, right?
It's not
and that, and I think that comes back to farmers markets. I think that the heirloom tomatoes and pomegranates, and not to say people didn't know about these things before, but the way they went from to the mainstream, I think came from farmers markets.
I think they'd forgotten about them. People did know about it a couple of generations ago when people farmed, or at least grew their own food, if not commercially. And then the push in the 50s for processed food, there was a whole generation that forgot what real food tasted like. Mm-hmm. So the farmers markets kind of brought that back.
Mm-hmm. And it feels less cosmic now. I feel like it was farmers markets were for weird hippies, with their straw basket, my mom being such a freak, and my friends would come over and be like, "Where did your parents get that?" I'm like, "The farmers market. It's kale. Don't eat it." But now it's cool to be at the farmers market.
Well, now it's on episodes of Parks and Rec, right? When you're featured in a plot point within a well-known television show.
Yeah, it's part of the zeitgeist.
You've made it.
Do you see that as a continuing trend, or would you like to make a prediction of where you see farmers market down the line, or how do you see it change? How do you see them changing in the future in the next couple of years?
That's another really good question. I think the way in which farmers markets used to be the place you would go to get the type of food that is sold at the farmers market, part of what has happened is that the quality of food in produce and grocery stores has gotten better. There's more ways that people can get their produce. And I think, there's still something at the very heart of the farmers market where you go and you get to know the people in your community and the farmer who grew the food. And I don't think that farmers market, that's what makes a farmers market great. But, in terms of being able to support farmers, I think farmers markets need to start thinking about, what are the opportunities to bring back some of those shoppers who may have gotten peeled off from some of the easy opportunities to get produce? Are there ways that we can be more competitive with the grocery stores and the delivery programs? And because I think what we have is we have that human, that people, that person-to-person connection that you can't really get anywhere else. And are there ways that we can make that easier for people at a time when so many people seem to struggle with time, right?
Yeah, exactly. The convenience is starting to it's a slippery slope, I think, because it's it's more convenient to go to the grocery store, get it delivered, but then we're losing that face-to-face contact, and that's what disconnects us from our food. Yeah. So if it's coming in a box, even though it's healthy, that's like a disconnect. So I think what's going to be the best thing to kind of keep that is to remind people this is where you can talk to the farmers that grew that food, keep that connection strong, bring your kids around that so they know it came from a person and it's not just on your doorstep when you open the door.
And also the whole message that what a huge financial difference it makes when you buy it direct from the farmer.
Yeah, exactly.
Not from the distributor down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the messages where I think farmers markets always have a strong case to make. And I think if there are little things that we can do to, and I think as markets mature, these kinds of things are likely to happen, right? Markets having storage space that allows them to just little things, have shopping carts for customers, right?
We're just talking about that.
Yeah.
Looking at, how do we make it easier for people to take home more food, right? So they can buy, so that the limiting factors aren't, the space, how much they can carry to their car, and trying to really help facilitate those sales to farmers, from farmers to consumers of that good food, while still letting them have that direct connection.
Yeah.
So keeping our farmers and vendors in mind, are there any food system or farmers market issues that we should be paying closer attention to? And if so, how can farmers market vendors and market managers get more involved with kind of the policy side of the industry that they're in?
I think the question of digital payments in the farmers market space is something that is a very interesting one, particularly as our federal programs move. So, many years ago, or not many years ago, 15 or so years ago, SNAP switched to the electronic form. A year before that, we called it food stamps, right? And now the WIC program is switching that way, and more people want to pay for things with cards or phones or something else that isn't physical money. And I think that may also be a real challenge for farmers markets going forward. But the pace with which technology is changing has been faster in some areas and slower in others. And one of the challenges in particular is around SNAP and WIC acceptance at farmers markets of those forms of payment. And so that's certainly an area to keep an eye on. I think these questions of federal nutrition programs and their role at farmers markets, I think, is something that unfortunately is difficult to make happen in farmers market settings for a whole host of reasons. But it's got, from my perspective, it's hugely important. For me, it's an equity issue. These programs need to be in place at farmers markets. And part of that is it's equity. It's an equity issue both for consumers, but also for farmers and vendors, because SNAP is a billion-dollar industry, and for them to be shut out of a huge way in which many people spend money on food is not okay either.
No, I didn't realize that myself until recently. I was like a month and a half ago, was on a panel at a food equity, food access kind of program. And the people on the panel with me were from 2 major grocery stores.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was talking about how important it was to make sure that SNAP was at farmers markets so that the people could get healthy food, they were talking about how important it was that the Farm Bill included SNAP because it was something like 14% of their income at these giant grocery chains.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of money that's going into the grocery industry from SNAP.
Yeah, and there's areas where the SNAP or WIC benefits have been, cut out or reduced, and it creates these food deserts because grocery stores can't stay open, and they need shoppers as much as shoppers need them.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah,
and the same applies to the farmers market. So when that goes away, a huge chunk of sales goes away from the farmers market.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, kind of on that same line of questions, we're going to move on to our wrap-up question of the week here. And we'll kind of ask the questions here and go around, but what seemingly small policy change would have a big impact on farmers markets? So if we could dream up a policy change that could get changed right away, what would that be? And how would that affect, what kind of impact would that have on the farmers markets? And we'll kind of go around here, Ben, so you can think about it for a minute, but, and then circle back to you. But Kat, what would be something that you think would affect the markets in a positive way if it could be changed?
Well, when you say a seemingly small policy change, so working with big government, I'm sure it's never a seemingly small or simple change, but it would seem really obvious to me that SNAP should be allowed to be used at farmers markets for prepared food. Yeah. So we can't do that at our farmers market. We're providing SNAP benefits. We're providing market match. You can't use that to get the African food that Cadron makes that's uses fresh vegetables from the farmers, but you can use it down the street at Jack in the Box. Yeah. And it's just so frustrating for our prepared food vendors and for our seniors and our folks that are in minimal housing where a cooked meal is important. They don't necessarily have a space to use the raw fresh vegetables that we sell. If they could buy it from somebody who's preparing healthy food, that would be great, but we're not allowed to do that at markets.
Yeah, absolutely.
That seems like a little thing to change. Ben, jump on that.
Ben, are you writing all these things down?
Yeah, that one's on my list.
Yeah. Justine, what's a policy change that you think about?
Okay, mine's a little self-serving, but as a farmers market vendor, I think that the entry point into farmers markets as a business owner is already, relatively small compared to other types of businesses. But I think that we'd see more small businesses being able to enter the farmers market if cottage food law didn't cap your gross income. It's, I think in California right now it's like $50,000, and to run a business on a gross of $50,000 is that's not a whole lot. And to be actually, to be able to support your family or to support yourself with that seems kind of impossible to me. So I think if, I'm sure there's a reason why that is, but if they could increase that cap, I think that you'd see a lot more farmers market businesses be able to flourish.
Yeah. Open up the doors for them a little bit more. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I would say, well, it's not, it doesn't seem like a small policy change because it seems like people think this is a big deal. But in California, as you know, and as some of our listeners may not realize, because when we go to farmers markets outside of California, I get very jealous. But in California, we have a lot of restrictions, or San Diego County, I guess.
California.
All California. Yeah. We have a lot of restrictions on value added. So our farmers can't even sell wreaths made from flowers and chili peppers and eucalyptus at their farms. Our beekeepers can't sell their beeswax candles, because of the wick. And even our nursery vendors can't put their succulents in a pretty pot to sell. Right. And not to mention they can't sell apple pie with their apples or pumpkin bread with their pumpkins and things that we see at all these other markets that I get really jealous of when I go to visit other markets. And it just seems like I get the reasoning that they don't want farm vendors to be selling way outside and be reselling lots of items and, very seriously reselling produce. That makes sense. But if it's very clearly made from products from their farms,
it's your peaches in the peach pie.
Yeah, it's your peaches.
They can make it a percentage, 80% or something like that.
Exactly. It just seems very they're not giving these farmers the opportunity that they could have to sustain their farms and to really increase the revenue for their farms when they're at the market and people are shopping for these things. They can go across the aisle and get a candle from just a candle maker, which is great, but they don't have a farm, but they can't buy it from their beeswax. It just seems silly to me. So I feel like that policy change could really make a huge impact for our farmers here in California.
Yeah, that's a good example. It's one of those ones where like, I understand why they have the rule. And I, as I understand it, part of it is also like what they don't want is they don't want, farmers taking something, the example that they always gave me was they didn't want a farmer selling adding a non-farm product that really increases the value of the product, like a fancy pot, when really what they're ultimately most of the value is in the pot, not the plant. But again, it's one of those things where the result is like a wick in a is a necessary piece of a candle, and it's like they can sell a chunk of beeswax, but it's the wick that adds the value. And that's, and then as you said, someone else who isn't a farmer isn't going through the full effort to raise the bees and melt the wax and mold the candle, is allowed to sell it and reap the benefit. It's one of those places where policy gets in the way of like the good, like what we want.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. With those regulations for good reasons also implemented.
Yeah.
We don't want it to turn into a big, like I went to a farmer's market in Phoenix and the farmer was selling Sara Lee bagels in his farm booth, which I guess was legal technically,
Right.
but then you're crossing into some weird lines. So, finding a happy medium ground where the farmers can be sustained. So Ben, what's something that I'm sure you just think about policy all day. So, but what's something, if you could like snap your fingers and make a change in some policy that you think would benefit, what would that be?
I'm going to go back to the issue of SNAP. And I think, it is not I recognize that, the way government works, but, the current technical security requirements that are in place for SNAP really I believe have restricted the development of new SNAP redemption software and technology. I think there are many companies out there who would love to develop the ability to process SNAP, but they haven't because these security requirements are antiquated and out of date. And as a result, it means that they would be, first of all, if they're doing credit and debit, they have to develop in two different environments. So they have to have software developers who know how to develop for both the credit and debit market, but then also for SNAP, because they're not the same. And then also it's like, who wants to, like, what forward-looking companies want to invest in old technology, right? Like they want to be on the cutting edge. So
I remember how prohibitive it was for us to just get started and filing all the paperwork and looking at all the systems we needed to do just to be able to accept it at our market.
Right.
And it would be so great if it was so much easier, because just think of the food access.
We're surprised how few farmers markets actually accept SNAP. Because the application process is onerous and the equipment management, and it's all kinds of scary things about keeping them secure. So
so limits that food access. So
and let me just, because I realize I'm thinking maybe people aren't seeing the impact. The reason that policy change would be important is additional development in this field. First of all, would probably have prevented a situation like the one that came up with Novadia. There would have been more competition to take place, and also the cost of equipment would be of processing would be lower, right? So it would make it easier for markets and farmers to make that choice. Right now, it costs hundreds of dollars to get it costs $700, $1,000 to get equipment to process SNAP. And if there was more competition, there could be cheaper equipment, and that would mean that more farmers markets and farmers would be able to accept it.
Exactly, just like credit card processing. So we have Square and PayPal and all those people that can process credit cards. Let's be nice if that was.
Let's make it easier
if it was available. For that as well. And we can maybe in our blog or our newsletter link to the story about Novadia, just because some of our listeners might not know the whole thing. So just listeners, we will link that so you can find that information on our Intense conference information. So Ben, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. I feel like this is all such important stuff that you do, and that is really relevant to everybody who's in the farmers market industry.
And who shops at
farmers markets, and who cares about food access, and who cares about this policy. It's just, so far reaching. So thank you for doing what you do.
Yeah. And thanks. We're really excited to have you be a speaker at Intense 2019.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for those kind words. I think it's really, there's a, as our field, our industry, our community, however you want to look at it, has grown, I think there's an opportunity, and I think there's a need for farmers markets, farmers and customers who care about them, to participate in this, because I don't think we have any elected officials. Well, I don't think we have very many. Nearly every elected official loves farmers markets. So it's not that we don't have a base of support. It's that we haven't tapped into the resources that we have, and we have, broad geography and a lot of goodwill. We just haven't had sort of the coordination, and don't always have the resources. But I think there's real opportunity, and part of why I like working in this work. So looking forward to seeing you all at the conference.
Great. See you in February.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks so much, Ben.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for listening along. Please leave us a review on iTunes and tell us how you liked today's episode. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss the next one. And if you want more farmers market tips, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter at intensebusiness.com and follow us on Instagram at intensebusiness. Remember, that's INTENTS business. The 2019 Intense Conference will be held in San Diego, February 24th through the 26th, and we hope that you will join us. Ben will be joining us at the Intense Conference to share more about how farmers market participants can influence the food system.
This podcast is produced by Intense Business, where passion meets profit. Today's episode was recorded and edited by Justine Marzoni Mead. Original music by David Mead. Special thanks to our guest, Ben Feldman, the Farmers Market Coalition, and San Diego Markets.